All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to today's lesson. My name is Nonye and I am your real estate tutoress. I'm a licensed agent here in the state of Illinois, as well as a licensed instructor, or pre licensed instructor. If you're new here, welcome and do consider subscribing. Now, on this channel, I bring you the best tips and tools to getting your real estate license. I also answer any questions you may have about the process. All right, so today we're going to be talking about fair housing. It's one of the topics you need to know for the examination. Now, a couple of things that we'll cover today include why fair housing, right? We want to understand why we need to know this. We need to understand what the federal protected classes are. We also need to know the Illinois protected classes under the Illinois Human Rights Act. Then we'll also talk about some fair housing practices and the implications for us as real estate licensees. All right, so these are things that you need to know for the exam, as well as when you begin to practice in this industry. So, if you don't already have something to write with, or your notes, or your textbook from your class, right? So, go ahead and grab those and let's jump into the material. All right. So, fair housing. So, why fair housing? First things first, why fair housing, right? So, fair housing is law. And essentially, the reason why fair housing became law was because it was about discrimination based on, we talk about different protected classes, but the initial one was race, and it was color, religion, and some other things, right? So the law was implemented to ensure that people get to choose where they want to live as long as they can afford it, right? They shouldn't be penalized because of how they were born, right? And so that's the main reason behind these fair housing laws. And um, for us as licensees, right, it is our duty to ensure that these laws are implemented because we are the ones helping people buy, sell, and lease real estate. So it's part of one of our responsibilities as licensees, right? Fair housing is federal law, right? It's there's federal and then there's state. So you need to make sure that as an individual, you're not violating federal and state laws. All right. So for us, we need to just be very careful in our practices so that we are compliant with the law because it's not worth losing your license or anything for one particular client or situation. All right. So the first time that fair housing was actually implemented was with the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Now, with this, race was the only, it was, sorry, it was eliminating discrimination based on race. So discrimination was prohibited based on race with the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Now, you need to know the year for this law. Okay, so Civil Rights Act of 1866 was the first anti-discrimination law implemented, and there was no exception to this law. So as you go through your book, you will see some exceptions to some of the other protected classes. But remember that for the Civil Rights Act of 1866, there was no exception to the law. So what does that mean for us? It means that in any transaction that we are part of, we need to make sure that there is no discrimination based on race. Okay, that's essentially what it means for us as licensees. So then, a couple years later, in 1968, so from 1866 all the way to 1968, then they had the Title 8 of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, sorry. All right, and this is kind of where they began to make ensure that this non-discrimination was implemented when it came to housing. And so the Fair Housing Act of 1968 had prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, and national origin. All right, so initially it was just race, then they added color, religion, and national origin. And because it's fair housing, right? So housing is a key word there. It also includes in the purchase, sale, or lease of real estate. You cannot discriminate against someone because they are a member of one of these protected classes. Essentially saying, hey, I'm not going to rent to you because you are either black, white, Latina, whatever it is, like Native American, or you're from this particular country, maybe you are Asian, Italian, whatever it is, right? Or your religion as well. So those were things that were definitely implemented there when it came to housing. All right. Now, a couple years later, 1974, they included sex. Prior to that, and this was mostly women, like women were really discriminated against when going to get housing. They would ask you either for your husband or your father to either co-sign for you or vouch for your um, ability to rent that place. And so even in granting credit, all right, so in 1978, they added sex as a protected class. And later on in 1988, they added two more: handicap or disability, including people with HIV/AIDS, and then also familial status, which is the presence of children or a pregnant woman um, in a community, essentially. So you can't discriminate because of the presence of children or a pregnant woman. All right. So the first year we talked about was 1866. Then we talked about 1966. Then, sorry, 1866, 1968 was the next one. And then now 1974 and 1988. All right, so those are the 4 years you got to remember for the federal protected classes as it pertains to fair housing. Now, these are all of the protected classes. So you got to remember all these for the exam and know the ones that are specific to the federal government. So race, color, national origin, religion, sex, handicap or disability, and familial status. Now, in the box here on the screen, you can see something that we use to help us remember the protected classes. So realtors can now really sell housing fast, right? Realtors can now really sell housing fast. If this helps you remember, that's great. If it doesn't, that's okay. But as long as you remember the protected classes for national. Again, if you remember, I told you to memorize the years, right? So also know like the protected classes that were added during those years. For example, that's why I broke it down in the previous screens. So for example, in 1968, we had race, color, religion, and national origin. Then sex was added later on. And then familial status and handicap were added together. And they were the last two in 1988. All right. So those are your federal protected classes. Now, just to give a brief definition, when we talk about housing, we're talking about residential places where people live. So essentially, 1 to 4 unit buildings is what we're referring to. And like I said earlier, familial status would be the presence of any individual who hasn't reached the age of 18, as well as women who are pregnant. All right. Because what was happening prior to 1988 was you will show up to rent a place with children and they're like, oh no, I can't rent you with these kids. They're going to mess up the home. You know, they're going to be loud or whatever. All right. I can't rent to you. And so families were stuck. People with children were stuck. Now, the other thing that was happening too was, let's say you come in without children, then it may be written in your lease that when you have a child, you have to leave. Or essentially, the lease becomes invalid and you have to move out. All right. So those types of things were actually eliminated. And if there's ever a clause like that right now, it cannot be enforced because it will be violating the fair housing laws of familial status. Okay. Now, as I go over these, if you have questions or need some more clarity, be sure to drop it in the comments and I will be glad to help for sure. Right? So, when we talk about disability, that's the next definition. So, with disability, it includes mental and physical disability and also people with HIV/AIDS. One other group that's been added recently are people with addictions. So, people with addictions too will fall under this disability. And the law requires that landlords allow people with disabilities make reasonable modifications to the property at their own cost. All right. So an example I have there on the screen, if you don't allow dogs, a service animal would be allowed because it's a service animal. All right. Um, there are some other reasonable modifications. For example, people may want to install grab bars on the wall to help them like stand up from either the toilet or help them get out of the tub. They may ask to widen the door if the doors are narrow and they have maybe a wide wheelchair. So that's a reasonable modification. Some people may need to put a ramp in front of a house to help them get into the house. That again is a reasonable modification, and it will be at the tenant's expense, not at the landlord's expense. Right? So please note those for the examination. And if the landlord agrees, or rather after the landlord agrees, because the landlord has to agree, right? So after the landlord agrees and this tenant is moving out, the landlord can actually require them to put the property back in its original state when they're moving out of the home, right? So the landlord doesn't have to be stuck with the changes that have been made by the tenant. Okay. All right. So your federal protected classes are again race, color, national origin, religion, sex, handicap or disability, and then familial status. So let's talk about Illinois' Human Rights Act. Under Illinois' Human Rights Act, we have a couple more that were added, but it includes the federal protected classes. All right, so all the federal protected classes are included, and then we have unfavorable military discharge, sexual orientation, age 40 and above, ancestry, marital status, military status, and also order of protection. So, with unfavorable military discharge, think about around Vietnam time or Second World War when people, for different reasons, were deserting the army or they were unfavorably discharged for whatever reason, right? This actually allowed them to come back and be able to get housing because people were, they would know who you were because you deserted the army and then you come home and they're like, I don't want to rent to you. So that became an issue, and that's why they were protected class. Of course, sexual orientation, age, all right, 40 and above. According to Illinois law, all right, according to Illinois law, if you are 40 and above, you're considered elderly according to Illinois law, and they cannot discriminate against you in Illinois because of your age. All right. And think about it though. Someone who is, for example, 65 and is getting a 30-year mortgage, right? Some people may look at them and say, why are you even bothering at 65 to get a 30-year mortgage? Because in 30 years, you will be 95. Will you be alive to continue making these payments? Well, as you all know, life is not promised to anyone. Like, no one is promised tomorrow. So even the person who is 25 may not live up to 60, right? So who's to say that someone who's 65 won't live up to 120, right? And so essentially, if people can afford it, they should be able to get it regardless of their age. Okay. Now with ancestry, we're talking about your sorry, I was trying to say like the difference between ancestry and national origin. For national origin, which is a federal protected class, that's the country where you're born. And then ancestry is your heritage. So, for example, you were born in China, but you are of Italian ancestry. Okay, so China will be your national origin, but your ancestry is Italian. Right? So, understand the difference between both. Ancestry is Illinois, national origin is federal protected class. And then marital status, right? So you won't be discriminated against because of that. military status, and then for order of protection. This is where if you have an order of protection against someone, it should not be used against you when you're trying to get housing. All right. So you may even be able to, depend on the severity of the situation, you may be able to break the lease to get out of that um, situation. All right. So these are for Illinois. And on the left side of the screen, I have USAAMO as one way to remember. And then on the right side, I have Mama's Ops. Oh, sorry, Mama's Oops. So whichever one works for you and helps you remember, please, you're free to choose. All right. Biggest thing is you just need to know which is which. Okay. So know the federal and then know the state. For the federal, you need to know when it was implemented, and then for state you just need to know all of the protected classes for the state, because one question they could ask you is which of the following is a federal protected class. All right, so you need to be able to differentiate between federal and state. Or in the state portion of the exam, they could ask you which of the following is a protected class in Illinois, so you would need to know the protected classes. All right, so now we're going to go into some fair housing practices. And there are three main ones you need to remember, but I have four on the screen, but there are three main ones you need to remember. First one is blockbusting or panic selling. With panic selling, what was happening is real estate agents, like real estate agents were the ones that were actually perpetrating a lot of the discrimination when it came to housing in the past, right? And so real estate agents will go to homeowners and say, hey, I don't know if you were paying attention, but family XYZ just moved into the house two doors down. All right. And on the street, on the other block, right, a similar family just moved in too. So they're coming into your neighborhood and they're going to pull down the property values. And so you need to sell or rent, and let's buy you something else in a different neighborhood so you can get out of this space because those people are coming, right? So you can insert whoever those people are to you. Okay. So real estate agents will go do this. Homeowners will feel that fear of, okay, these people are coming, they're going to devalue my property, I need to sell. Now, this was a profit making it was also profit driven for these real estate agents, because if you think about it, this seller is going to be like, oh my gosh, okay, can you help me sell my house, and can you also help me buy another house? So there was also some of that agents were doing at that time. And so blockbusting is against fair housing laws, right? Even the suggestion that the presence of a certain protected class in a community will decrease property values is a violation of fair housing laws. Okay, so even a suggestion. All right, so when you're taking the exam, have that in mind. And if they ever give you some sort of scenario question where it's kind of like a real estate agent was having a meeting with a seller and suggested that because a certain group was moving in, or the community was becoming more diverse, right? The values may be dropping. So that's 100% a violation of fair housing laws. The second one is steering. Now think about your car's steering wheel. Okay, so when you're steering something, what are you doing? You're either moving it towards a certain direction or you're moving it away from one direction. That's the same thing with housing. So we could be moving our clients or steering our clients towards a particular neighborhood or steering them away from a particular neighborhood because they're a member of a protected class. That would be considered steering and a violation of the fair housing laws. So individuals should be able to choose where they want to live. Now, you may be wondering, well, what if someone comes up to me and says, well, I want to live in a safe neighborhood? What do I do? All right. Your answer to them would be, what is safe for you? Like, what are you looking for? So you got to ask more clarifying questions so that they lead you to where they want to live. as opposed to you saying, oh, okay, I got you. Now this area is safe, this one's not safe. Let's just go this way. You're steering them in one direction. So even if they ask you, all right, now that's what the law says. Even if they ask you, where should we live? Now you got to ask them more questions because ultimately it's their choice. So on the exam, don't let that fool you. Where they may say a client comes and says, I want to live among my people. Maybe someone who's an immigrant. I want to live among my people. Now, my question to you is, who are your people, right? What constitutes a community that has your people? All right. And then I could ask more questions and then we can, based on their answer, and then we could furthermore narrow it down to certain communities. Now, here's the thing to keep in mind. Remember, I said about fair housing in general. People should get to choose where they want to live. So, if, for example, I see an immigrant family who just came to the U.S. fresh, right? They've been here a week, but they have a lot of cash, so they wanted to buy a home right away, right? So now they're like, oh, and for me, I'm like, oh, well, since they're new, perhaps they may want to be among like people who are of their culture and familiar. So this is me thinking, right? They're familiar with so that they can um, speak their language, maybe be able to buy their foods that are similar to theirs, blah, 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 blah. All right. So for me, I'm in a city like Chicago where we have lots of neighborhoods, lots of ethnicities and things like that. So it will be easy for me to kind of direct them in that place. But that's me being presumptive. What if they fled their home country, came here and want nothing to do with their heritage, right? So my intention was great, but my intention was also leading to um, essentially what's the word I'm looking for? Segregation, right? My intention was going to lead to segregation, and it wasn't allowing the buyers choose where they want to live. So then I should ask them, where do you want to live? Okay. And if they tell me, oh, we want to be in this particular neighborhood, that's where I will help them find a house. Okay. I spent a bit more time on steering just because steering can be very, very subtle, especially in big cities where people are like, well, I heard this neighborhood is terrible, and I heard this and I heard that. Just be very careful because what if this person was a spy? All right, because actually the government does it. I don't know how often or what communities they do it, but sometimes they send out people to test to see if real estate agents are actually complying with the law. Right, so just be very, very careful when you respond to certain questions like that, and also on the exam. All right. So blockbusting or panic selling, steering, and then those are the two main ones. And the third main one is redlining. All right. With redlining, this is where they were literally drawing a red line around certain neighborhoods and communities, and insurance companies and mortgage lenders were not lending to people who wanted to purchase in those communities, or they were hiking up the rates. All right. So you could have all the financial capability, but because you were buying in a certain neighborhood, the rules were different. You were paying more, or they were even refusing to give you the loan or the insurance policy. So that is red lining. Redlining as well is a violation of the Fair Housing Act. The other one on the screen there is advertising. Now, we've talked about all the protected classes, right? And how we should not be discriminating. And so, anytime we are advertising, our advertising should not have discriminatory language in it, right? It should not be exclusive. It shouldn't even talk about the people, all right? So, if you get any examples on the exam, any scenario type questions that have to do with advertising, you're looking to see, are they describing people? So they could say, oh, it's a neighborhood with lots of activities, parks, it's close to the beach, restaurants, malls, transportation, all of those things. Versus It's a community for families, for maybe young professionals, or um, people of this particular religion, or people. It's 100% this ethnicity. Now, once we begin to talk about the people, then we are on that. We're crossing that line where it goes from compliance to non-compliance. Okay, so that's kind of how you should just be reading some of these questions. If we're talking about the community, about the house, all right, about like the features in that community, then that's good. But once you start describing the people that make up that community, then we've crossed that line. All right. The other thing they may throw at you would be um, advertising, for example, in just one, like let's say the house is in an area that's densely populated by Asians, and so you're only advertising to Asian people so they can come live there, right? That's also kind of a violation of fair housing laws because anyone should be able to live there, not just Asians, right? Okay, so we talked about the protected classes, right? And one of the things I said was you can't discriminate based on that. So, speaking of the exam, one other thing they might throw at you to kind of see if you really understand what they mean and you can apply the law is they may ask you about discriminating against someone that is not a protected class. So, let me give you an example. So, let's say this is a question I saw in a book. I don't remember where, but it had something to do with this, where a woman tells her real estate agent not to advertise in a certain newspaper that is owned by her ex-husband. Is this discrimination? So a woman tells her agent not to advertise in the newspaper that's owned by her ex-husband. Is that discrimination? Right? So for that one, the answer was no, because the only reason she's discriminating against this newspaper is because it's owned by her ex-husband. It's not anything to do with the protected classes, right? But instead, if it said don't advertise here because it's um it's some ethnic or it's some religious magazine or some whatever, right? Now we're discriminating against the protected classes and not just the ex-husband who she just doesn't like him, right? That's just her reason for it. Okay, hope that makes sense. All right, so here are some examples that I also put together. um an apartment building has several units, but then when a Muslim family asks to see one of the units, the owner tells them, oh no, they're no longer available. But then somebody else comes and he's going to show it to them, right? So that's an example. A man who uses a wheelchair is charged an extra processing fee when he applies to lease an apartment. After he gets the apartment and is speaking with other tenants, he learns no one else was charged this particular fee. Right? So landlords cannot change policies because of to that will harm people with disabilities. And then finally, a real estate licensee places the following advertisement in a newspaper. Just listed, perfect home for Caucasian family near excellent parochial school. All right. So you can see there is race exclusivity, right? So you're saying it's only for a Caucasian family and excellent parochial school. So parochial is more or less like narrow-minded. So essentially what you're saying is we just need a certain group of people to come live in this house. All right. So that would be a violation of fair housing laws. Some of the things you may see, and some every now and then you begin to see it, even on our MLS, people talking about across the street from a church or something, or so that's religion, or exclusive neighborhood, right? So words like that, you could say it's a gated community. You don't have to say it's an exclusive neighborhood, because then it's like exclusive to whom. Um, so those types of things, you just have to be careful. Again, describe the area and not the people, or that debtors on the protected classes. All right, so some exceptions to the rule. Remember that there is no exception when it comes to race. Owners who occupy the property, when they are looking for tenants, the law allows them to essentially discriminate against who they can let to live in the building. So let me give you an example. Let's say I'm not licensed, okay? So I'm licensed, so I can't do any of this stuff. So I'm not licensed, right? Example, I'm not licensed. And then I am renting my own place. It's a 4 unit building, and I live in one of the units. So someone who is not licensed can decide they don't want children in the building, or they don't want a certain race or religion in the building. So as long as they're not working with a real estate agent and they don't advertise as saying they don't want certain people in that building when they're looking for their tenants, then they're allowed to do such. Okay. And the final one there on the screen, private clubs or organizations can limit occupancy to their members, but they cannot discriminate against who becomes a member. For example, a country club may have housing that's only open to maybe a member who is really struggling with some financial needs, right? And just needs a place to stay temporarily or something. Or let's say a religious organization has housing and they only make it open to their members. Okay, that's fine as long as they don't discriminate against who becomes a member. So we're not saying that these organizations are exempt from discriminating against, based on the protected classes, or that they're exempt from fair housing laws. What we're saying is that they are exempt only if it's for housing for their members only, and they have to apply the same principle across the board for everybody else. Here's one way I used to remember this is, for example, let's say a university has dorm rooms for the students. Now, if you're not a student of that university, you can't just show up and tell them you want to live in the dorms. They won't most likely give you access, right? But if you're a member, if you're a student, right, then you can go apply for housing and get housing if it's available, right? So they can discriminate against who lives in the building, but they can't discriminate against who becomes a member of their organization, right? So far we've talked about the protected classes, we've talked about federal, state, and then we talked about blockbusting, redlining, advertising, and then also steering. Now, what's the implication for us as licensees? Now, fair housing is the law. It is our duty as licensees to make sure that this is enforced and every transaction a licensed person is a part of, and this is across the country. Any transaction that a licensed person is a part of should be free from discrimination based on the protected classes. It is our duty, if our clients are not being compliant, it is our duty to make sure that they know about these laws and that together we are compliant. Now, I will say this, we are all human. We all have our own biases, we all have our own backgrounds. And so, nobody, at least I would say from what I know, I can't say there's anyone who doesn't have some sort of preconceived notion or stereotypes of people. But this the test of maturity is as you realize your prejudice, right? You make corrections and you try to do better. So even as licensees, we may have our own issues, right? Based on our past. But as we're working with people, we have to be checking those and like, okay, this is my prejudice. I need to squash that because I need to treat everyone fairly and equally. If someone asks you a question that is somewhat leading towards steering, send them resources so they can get their answers from those resources. Example, if they're like, well, I want my kids to go to a good school. Well, here is this website that has the ranking of schools. All right. Put in if we find a house, put in the address and see what district the school is a part of. And if it's to your taste, then let's go for it, right? So things like that are how we should be addressing these issues. Or you could direct them to the superintendent of that school district and they can ask questions of that person. If a licensee is found to be discriminating or violating the fair housing laws, it could lead to a loss of license. Financial penalties is a civil case. So you're not just losing your license, but you're being brought before sometimes federal courts, right? And that's something that you don't want for yourself. And remember, this is just for one transaction. And you can allow one transaction ruin your entire life or your entire career. So just keep that in perspective. Okay? Ignorance is not an excuse. So saying, oh, I didn't know I was being discriminatory will not be a valid excuse. So it is our responsibility to know and ensure that we are not violating the fair housing laws. All right. And a great question to ask is, am I providing the same service to everyone? Okay. And like I said earlier, you may realize that you're not, and that's okay. What do? You correct yourself. Okay. So the question here on the screen is, what do you do if your client is not complying with the Fair Housing Act? First thing you do is talk to your sponsoring broker, right? Talk to your sponsoring broker, let them know the situation. In our contracts, our brokerage agreements, we are required to disclose that we are complying with fair housing laws. For the most part, whatever form you're going to use in your practice will have that disclosure in there. So our clients already know from the disclosure that we are complying with the law. So now we just need to remind them that, hey, you signed this paperwork that says you will not discriminate based on these protected classes. So we cannot help you in this situation. Like, we cannot support you in discriminating. If they're insistent and they don't want to not discriminate, we may have to terminate our agreement with them. Because like I said, we could lose our license. Also, now your sponsoring broker is aware. If your sponsoring broker and you continue, guess what? Your sponsoring broker also gets into trouble because you both knew that you were violating fair housing laws and you continued with the client. Okay? So please be aware of this for the exam and also in your practice. All right, so I have a few questions here that we'll just do as a wrap up. All right, first one is, a licensee entered into a buyer agency agreement with a Japanese man. The licensee showed him only properties where it is obvious that other Japanese people lived. Has the licensee violated fair housing law? All right. So if you're watching this, you could pause and go through it, and then we'll talk about the answer. All right. So first one says yes, is blockbusting. Second one says no, because a Japanese buyer would want to live in a Japanese neighborhood. Third, no, because as a buyer agent, it is the licensee's responsibility to make decisions for the buyer. And then finally, yes, the licensee is guilty of steering. All right, so how I would approach this is, first things first, we look to see, are they violating fair housing laws? Either a yes or a no. If you say yes, then you're going for A or D. If you say no, you're going for B or C. So let's say you say no. First no is B, because a Japanese buyer would want to live in a Japanese neighborhood. That's not true, right? We don't know that about this person. It's not in the question. So that can be correct. Second one, because as the buyer agent, you make all the decisions for your buyer. 100% not true, right? It's the client that gets to choose where they want to live, right? So it's not a no. Now let's go to the yeses. First, yes, A, the licensee is guilty of blockbusting, or they're guilty of steering. All right, so what are they doing? They're guiding them towards a certain area. So that would be steering. All right, so remember steering? I told you with a car. So we're steering them in a direction. We're steering them towards neighborhoods where it's obvious that other Japanese people. So our answer would be D as in dog. And I know I gave a long explanation. If I was just doing this in my head, it wouldn't take that long for me to figure out the answer, but I was just explaining it so that it kind of walks you through the process. And this is what you need to do as you are answering questions. And the more you do it, the quicker and easier it would be for you. Okay. Here's the next question. Again, you can pause, answer, and then check out the answer later. This one says, which of the following questions would not be construed as being discriminatory in nature when asked of a buyer? First one, do you have children? Second, how many family members will be living with you? Third, what church do you attend? Four, or D, sorry, what type of house are you looking for? Okay. Now, if you remember earlier, I told you when we start talking about people, we're kind of crossing that line from compliance to non-compliance. So how many children, how many family members, um, what church, religion, right? So those are all protected classes. Children would be familial status. Family members, so we're asking um, more or less, so that one is, let's leave that one first. We'll come, I'll tell you why it's not. All right, so church, religion. All right, so A and C are out because it's familial status and church, religion, sorry. So now B and D. On the exam, you're always choosing the best answer. On the exam, you're always choosing the best answer. So I could ask you how many family members will be living with you. That's maybe assuming you're married and you have a family, right? So that's kind of borderline non-compliance, right? Because I could have asked how many people are going to live in this house, so that it's not like I'm assuming you have a traditional family. So that's kind of where this one is at. But the reason why the answer is D is because D is more objective. So it's like, what type of house are you looking for? Are you looking for a ranch style house? Are you looking for a two-story? Are you looking for a condo? How many bedrooms do you need? Those types of questions, right? So we're not tethering on fair housing, but we're just keeping it on the property that they're looking for, right? So that's why I would pick D over B. Okay. And so, with that, we have come to the end of today's lesson. I hope this was beneficial to you. Go back, review. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments below. Also, in the comments, in the description, rather, I have left links to certain practice material or prep tools that you can use as you prepare for the exam. Um, Check out my channel for additional videos to help you with the topics that you are covering on the exam. And let me know too if there are other topics you want me to cover. I also have the Facebook group where you could easily just ask me questions, and I'll be glad to connect with you through that as you go through getting your license. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. All right, take care.